Show yourself.
The main defining concept at the heart of Sifu is as simple as it is interesting. So simple, in fact, that you are able to understand it just by looking at a trailer of the game. Sifu is a game inspired by martial arts media that merges the feel of old-school brawlers with a more modern and precise gameplay that emphasizes a very dynamic, free-flowing combat that is flashy yet deep and hard to master. However, Sifu's central gimmick, the main thing that immediately hooks you in about this game, is its very unique take on a very old gaming convention: death. In Sifu, every time you die, your character immediately revives, allowing you to continue to play at the cost of growing old. If your character dies at 20 years old, they will age by 1 year before coming back to life, now at 21 years old. I've always loved so much when developers add creative twists to the concept of death as a game mechanic. And yet, narratively speaking, Sifu's take on dying is, like I said, so straightforward that you can understand how it's supposed to work as a central metaphor for the story just by looking at a small sample of the game. Sifu is a revenge story. As such, the game's unique mechanic of aging every time you die is symbolic of the way in which the protagonist's life is being consumed by a relentless desire for revenge. It's a metaphorical cycle of violence taken to a literal extreme. That being said, just because Sifu's main narrative conceit is straightforward on first glance, it doesn't mean that it's bad. In fact, this kind of simplicity allows us to dive into the story in an organic way that is crucial for a game that is as gameplay focused as Sifu is. And so, the question then becomes, does Sifu manage to use its unique death mechanic as a springboard to explore deeper themes and tell a compelling story? That's the question that I want to try to tackle in this video, but first, we need to outline Sifu's plot as well as talk about its narrative structure. The plot of Sifu is very simple and straightforward too, at least during your initial playthrough. The story starts on a rainy night 8 years prior to the main events of the game, as Yang, the main antagonist, and 4 other people raid the nameless protagonist's martial arts school, murdering her father and mentor in the process, as well as every other student present there, with the goal of stealing a magical artifact. Yang's motivations are unknown to us at this time, but we do learn that the reason the protagonist was able to survive a fatal wound was because she was holding on to a magical talisman that allowed her to come back from death, the same talisman that continues to revive her as we play through the game. The protagonist then spends the next 8 years planning her revenge by gathering information on Yang and the people who aided him, as well as training to polish her martial arts skills so that she can actually carry out that revenge. Then, the main events of the game take place over a single day, throughout which the protagonist raids 5 different locations and is able to track down and kill every single one of her targets one by one, culminating in a final confrontation against Yang himself. At the end of the story, the protagonist manages to take down Yang, completing her revenge quest, and she lets out a big sigh of relief that is quickly cut short by what looks like a pained expression. This is the plot of Sifu in the broadest possible strokes, and it's a pretty conventional revenge story. the protagonist's father is murdered, the protagonist trains, the protagonist goes on a killing spree and completes her revenge, and, in the end, the protagonist feels at peace for a moment before realizing that revenge will never actually grant her the peace that she has been seeking. However, if we look at the structure of the game as well as its storytelling style, the overall narrative of Sifu becomes a bit more interesting. Like I said before, Sifu is a very gameplay-focused game. The only cutscenes that we get as we play take place before and after each boss fight, and they are brief and don't give us a lot of meaningful information. Instead, Sifu conveys its story to us mostly through subtle details baked into the game's levels, also known as environmental storytelling, as well as through a series of collectible items that unlock lore entries that expand upon the game's story. These items are collected in a quote-unquote detective board, which is accessible while you are back at the game's hub area or directly from the game's menu. I find this detective board interesting because it frames the story as a kind of thriller/mystery type of thing that we need to piece together. However, the fact that the narrative of the game is taking place mostly in the background and that you must go out of your way to dig into the game's lore to even understand it, creates a sense of ambiguity that I think is really important and which I'll come back to later. For now, it's enough to say that the detective board gives us a greater understanding of the game's underlying story, as well as of the characters and motivations of the 5 main bosses of the game, Yang himself included. Looking through the detective board, we learn that the protagonist's father belonged to a group called the Guardians, and that the purpose of this group was to protect a set of artifacts with the power to corrupt the world. After Yang's family became ill, Yang asked the protagonist's father to use the power of the artifacts to heal them. When his plea was rejected and his family died, Yang created a new group called the Alchemists, who have taken a very different vow: to take control of the artifacts and use their power for the greater good, which of course meant that they had to first kill the Guardians in order to get a hold of the artifacts. These are the events that ultimately led to Yang's attack on the protagonist's school 8 years before. Thus, the story of Sifu is deeper and more complex than it appears at first. However, this complexity is easy to miss during your first playthrough. I've only grown to appreciate Sifu's story after playing through the game a few times. Now, don't get me wrong, I collected all of the detective board items during my first playthrough, and I learned about this hidden lore of the Guardians and the Alchemists, but I understood the story as a very simple and straightforward affair nonetheless. Even if we take into consideration the added lore of the detective board, the story of Sifu seems to fall along some very conventional and expected tropes. There is a secret group of people guarding some evil and dangerous magical artifacts. Then, when Yang's family becomes ill, he is consumed by grief and wants to use this evil power for selfish reasons. And when the protagonist's father prevents him from doing so, Yang decides to kill the Guardians and take the artifacts for himself, claiming that his actions are driven by a desire to do good. After killing the Guardians and stealing the artifacts, Yang opens up a sanctuary in which he uses the power of the artifacts to heal people. And, of course, I wasn't fooled by Yang's actions even for a minute. Yang claims that he is using the artifacts for good, but surely he must be doing something else behind closed doors. He is obviously using the artifacts to conduct some sinister and evil experiments or something like that, right? Yang is, after all, the villain of the story, a villain who, like so many villains before him, claims to actually be doing good in an attempt to misdirect us. And this is, in fact, how I thought about the narrative of Sifu during my first playthrough. But the more I played the game, the more I started to think of the story in a more nuanced and less black and white manner. The story of Sifu is built upon this binary of the Guardians versus the Alchemists, but the game is ambiguous enough that we never really get a sense of which of these two groups is in the right. The Guardians claim that the artifacts are corrupt and evil, and that they must be kept hidden from the world in order to protect the people. But why should we take their word for it? Or consider Yang's role in the story. In a general sense, when someone takes action against the established status quo, they are deemed as evil not by virtue of what they might stand for, but because of the simple fact that they stand against the status quo. This is why revolutionaries sometimes get labeled as terrorists by society at large, or why people fighting for basic human rights are called radical, or why queer people are deemed evil by the alt-right simply for existing. And so I started thinking, what if Yang and the alchemists are not as evil as they appear to be at first? Obviously, Yang's actions were extreme, and they were in part driven by grief. But what if Yang is ultimately justified in doing what he did? What if these artifacts are not really corrupt? And what if the Guardians were not just trying to protect people by guarding them? What if, in fact, the Guardians were just trying to hoard that power for themselves, as Yang claims? And what if Yang, after losing everything, has now returned that power to the common good, using it to help people instead? In other words, what if Yang and the alchemists dismantled a corrupt system built on lies and dared to implement a new, better system that actually benefits people? The more you think about the underlying story of Sifu, the more you stop seeing it as a clear-cut thing, and the more you start to wonder about the spaces left by the game's ambiguity, which in turn makes you realize that nothing is as simple as it seems, and that maybe Sifu is asking us to question the tropes that it presents in order to say something about the narratives that surround power. Except that, now, you see, you've fallen into my trap, because the true brilliance of Sifu is that none of the things that I just discussed, this hidden lore of the Guardians and the Alchemists and Yang's family and the true motivations behind his actions, none of it actually matters at all, and that's the point. Because, ultimately, Sifu's story is not about the events that led to the murder of the protagonist's father, it's about the events that happened after.
You were supposed to guard the talisman, not steal it!
It's the only way to save them, Sifu!
You failed to honor your oath. You are unworthy. Now leave. She who has Gong Fu and Wu De makes the other know she can break him. Her hands go out like lightning, and the other doesn't want to fight anymore.
I mentioned earlier that I really like how the game uses the detective board to create ambiguity, and here's what I mean by that. The detective board frames the story as a kind of mystery that we need to solve by putting together all of these pieces of lore that give us an insight into the events of the past. But in doing this, the game creates a distance that fundamentally separates the player from the protagonist. We, as the player, want to know the story of the game. We want to understand why Yang did what he did. We want to know if he was justified in his actions. We want to know if he is evil or not, if he is really using the power of the artifacts for the greater good or not. We want to put the pieces together. The protagonist, on the other hand, wants only one thing. To the protagonist, it doesn't matter who the Guardians or the Alchemists were, or which group was ultimately in the wrong. To her, it doesn't matter if the motivations of Yang and his group were ultimately justified. In fact, if the protagonist were to find concrete proof that Yang is using his newfound power to bring in a new era where no diseases will ever take anybody's family away from them ever again, it wouldn't matter, because Yang killed her father, and so now she must kill Yang. The protagonist will not, cannot stop until she has killed Yang. That's what it means to be obsessed by revenge, to be blind to the situation around you because the only thing that matters is that one terrible final goal. And so, in the eyes of the protagonist, the complexity of the events around her simply fades into the background. Getting to Yang is the only thing that matters, regardless of the cost. I think it's really cool that we never really learn the name of Sifu's protagonist because, in the end, not even that matters. Who the protagonist was before the death of her father does not matter. The protagonist has been reduced to a single burning desire for revenge. That's all she is now. That's all that matters. And that's what drives her to the tragedy that revenge stories ultimately represent because, of course, we know that revenge will not bring the peace and the release that the protagonist yearns for. Nothing can do that. That's what grief is. And that's the painful lesson that the protagonist must learn in the end. Except that, once again, this is not the whole story because if you've played through Sifu, then you know that killing Yang is not actually the ending of the game. Not really. Now, what happens after defeating Yang for the first time, on a literal level, is a bit ambiguous and open to interpretation, but basically, we get a cutscene in which the protagonist learns about Yang's family, followed by some lines of dialogue where the protagonist's father lectures her on the concept of Wuda, which is implied to be some form of enlightened state. After this cutscene, we are returned to the beginning of the game with the newfound understanding that there is some true ending to Sifu that we must learn to unlock. To get the true ending of Sifu, you must replay each level, only instead of killing the bosses at the end, you must perform a series of actions to spare their lives. If you spare the lives of the first 4 bosses, you can then go on to confront Yang one more time and spare his life too, which unlocks the true ending of the game. In this new ending, the protagonist still defeats Yang, but she pulls back on the final punch, letting herself be hit by Yang instead. The protagonist collapses and, because Yang is now in possession of the protagonist's talisman, it's implied that the protagonist dies and finally reaches a state of enlightenment. Now, whether this moment at the end represents a literal or a metaphorical death, I'm not sure, but I think that what really matters is that the protagonist, in this moment, is finally able to let go of her anger and her desire for revenge and is ultimately able to find a measure of peace. But here is where the game's story loses me a bit. The problem that I have with Sifu's true ending is that I just don't buy it. Or perhaps a better way to put it would be to say that this ending doesn't quite land for me. I understand the desire to have the story end in a big emotional moment of redemption, but having the protagonist go from wanting to kill everybody to sparing their lives in order to attain enlightenment is a massive emotional turn that I'm not sure the game really earns, at least not entirely. Let me explain. I love the cutscene that takes place after killing Yang for the first time, in which the protagonist learns about Yang's family, because it forces her to reckon with the truth that she's been trying to push down. That Yang is not just some one-dimensional evil villain, and that there's a whole history of events that led up to the death of her father 8 years before. This moment is, essentially, the first crack. After this cutscene, we go back to the beginning of the game, but something has fundamentally changed within the protagonist. She can't help but see the context around her in a different way. The distance between the protagonist and the player shortens as the protagonist begins to see Yang and his accomplices as complex individuals, each with their own pain, their own grief, their own motivations, as she tries to put the pieces together and understand why things played out the way they did. However, I don't know if there's enough work put into the narrative of the game to really earn that true ending. Having the protagonist confront the truth of Yang's family at the end of the first playthrough is a nice first step, but it's not enough in and of itself to really drive the story's huge emotional turn, at least in my opinion. It feels like there is a series of steps missing between the cutscene that we get during the bad ending of Sifu and the one that we get during the true ending. As it is, it just feels too easy, too simple. During the first playthrough, the protagonist wants to kill everybody and nothing can stop her. Then we finally kill Yang, we get a cutscene, and then we do another playthrough, only now the protagonist is suddenly fully enlightened and ready to spare everybody's lives and forgive all. This is why the true ending of the game rings a bit hollow for me, and as such, I think that Sifu, as a work of storytelling, ultimately fails to take all of its concepts and themes and use them to build towards a meaningful resolution. Now, the question of why Sifu ultimately fails to create a satisfying ending is one that I've asked myself a lot, And don't get me wrong, I think it would have been absolutely possible to use this convention of the bad ending versus the good ending to have the story of Sifu end on a redemptive note, but there was no work done towards actually accomplishing this on a narrative level. The true ending of Sifu feels hollow, like it's there just because it's expected, or because the developers wanted to add replayability to the game, or simply because they couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap between gameplay and story in a more organic way. Ideally, I would have preferred it if the game either built up towards an emotional climax that culminated with Yang's death during the bad ending, or that the game fully committed to its true ending by using repeated playthroughs to outline and develop the protagonist's shift in perspective, similar to what Hades does, for example. And, in fact, I think that if we take the quote-unquote bad ending of Sifu as it currently is, this is still a pretty interesting ending in its own right, even if it ends on a tragic tone rather than a redemptive one. After all, that's the nature of revenge stories. I mean, the protagonist of Sifu was 12 years old when her father was murdered, and from that moment on, all she did was train and prepare for revenge. As such, revenge is the only thing she has ever known, literally. It is the thing that defines her, it is everything that she is, and because of this, she cannot let go of it. Letting go of revenge would be like letting go of herself as a person, and so, in the end, killing Yang doesn't bring resolution. It only brings a sense of emptiness because now, with her goal completed, there's nothing left inside of her. And that's a tragic ending, but there's something moving and emotionally powerful about it. Ultimately, Sifu's story didn't need a big redemptive twist at the end just for the sake of having one. So why did the developers of Sifu end up coming up with an uninspired true ending that resolves the game on a hollow note? Well, I do have one theory for it, and it's also my biggest criticism of Sifu as a whole. I think that Sifu's biggest problem is that it is a game that seems to be fundamentally caught between two extremes. Sometimes I get the feeling that Sifu is very interested in using its very unique gameplay elements to tell a compelling and complex story, to use the gameplay as a kind of springboard to dive into some very deep narrative themes in ways that only a video game can do. But other times, it seems like Sifu just wants to be a really cool martial arts game that we are meant to understand as nothing but a surface level kind of power fantasy. A game that we play for the sake of its gameplay more than anything else. And in the end, I don't think that Sifu is able to navigate this relationship between gameplay and story in a successful manner, and as such, the story of the game is the one that ends up suffering.
Open it! Open up! Don't make me bust this damn door down! Okay.
Let me start by saying something obvious. The combat of Sifu is incredible. For one, it is visually stunning in the way in which each fight flows gracefully as you move from one move to the next, from one opponent to the next one. In fact, it is a testament to how well designed the combat is that even when you're not that good at the game, you still look and feel cool as you play. Sifu's combat is built on a system that is easy to pick up but hard to master. It has a very free-flowing, improvisational quality to it, yet it still requires that you practice and ingrain every move into the muscle memory of your fingers, that you learn the attack patterns of the enemies in the game, that you master the way fights change up the pacing of the combat depending on how many enemies you're facing at any given moment, that you learn to use your surroundings and take every opening that's offered to you. In other words, Sifu does a great job of taking the very concept of martial arts and translating it into a video game form. However, if we pull back a bit and look at the design of the game as a whole, that's when we can see some design choices that seem to be at odds with one another, particularly as it relates to the aging mechanic. The main element at the center of Sifu is its aging mechanic. This is what makes the game unique. It is what drives not only the gameplay but the overall narrative of the game as well. And yet, it doesn't feel like Sifu fully commits to this mechanic. In fact, the game makes some design choices that seem to specifically undermine the aging mechanic to some degree. Now, on a first glance, Sifu's unique take on death might give the impression that the game employs a form of permadeath or quasi-permadeath to frame the overall experience. When the player dies, the protagonist simply gets back up and the game continues, seemingly with no consequences or stakes. However, eventually you'll learn that if you die after reaching the age of 70, then you'll die for real. Dying above 70 years old takes you to a game over screen and your progress is reset. This is, ideally, what the loop of the game should have been. You must make use of the time you have to master the gameplay. You must learn the layout of the levels. You must polish your combat skills. You must come up with strategies until you die for real and must start over again in an endless pursuit of mastery and enlightenment. And, of course, this loop becomes symbolic of the game's narrative too. The protagonist of the game is on a revenge quest. Even after dying over and over, she keeps stubbornly getting up and trying again, driven by grief into this endless cycle of violence and death. In practice, however, Sifu doesn't actually commit to this loop because Sifu doesn't actually have a form of permadeath. The game's unique and very interesting take on death is undermined by what I consider to be two strange design choices. First, we have the game's surprisingly conventional checkpoint system. See, when you die for real after reaching 70 years old, you don't really go back to the beginning of the game. This is because every time you beat one of the 5 levels of the game, you get a checkpoint that you can go back to whenever you want. Now, the idea behind this design choice is that you can go back to replay earlier levels to try to beat them with a lower age. For example, if you beat the first level at 40 years old, that doesn't give you much leeway for the following levels, so you can go back and replay the first level and beat it at 30 years old instead, or 25 or 20. You could argue that, in this way, the game still pushes you to keep trying to polish your skills and get better, but to me, this system of checkpoints really undermines what makes the aging mechanic so interesting. Another way the game's design undercuts the aging mechanic is through the implementation of in-level shortcuts. Basically, as you play through each level, you'll unlock shortcuts that will make the levels easier and shorter the next time you play them. Much like the checkpoints at the end of levels, these shortcuts don't really feel like they were added to the game in order to support the central mechanic of aging, but quite the opposite. It feels like they are there to deliberately undermine it. The thing about Sifu is that it is, just in general, a very difficult and inaccessible game. The combat demands a lot of skill and patience from the player, and I think that the developers knew this, so they made design choices that would specifically make the game more accessible or approachable to a wider audience, such as including checkpoints at the end of each level, as well as shortcuts that make the levels easier to beat once you've unlocked them. But this, in turn, undermines Sifu's unique take on death as a mechanic because, ultimately, there's not that much at stake once you finally die, not when you can just replay each level as much as you want and not when you can skip entire levels after you've beaten them only once. Ideally, and this is just my personal opinion, I kind of wish that Sifu would have committed to its aging mechanic all the way, forcing the player to go back to the beginning of the game after they die above 70 years old, even if that would come at the cost of making the game a lot more difficult. Now, by mentioning this, I'm not trying to make an argument for or against accessibility in games. My point here is that Sifu, to me, comes off as a game torn between two extremes. On the one hand, the developers came up with a really cool take on the mechanic of death and wanted to build a game around it, but on the other hand, the developers also wanted to make a game that was accessible to a wider audience, and so they made design choices that deliberately undermined the game's central mechanic. And the thing about Sifu is that it can't seem to decide what it wants to be, and we can apply this same train of thought to the greater identity of the game as a whole. On the one hand, it feels like Sifu wants to tell an interesting story, like it wants to use its gameplay mechanics and overall design as a way to explore themes like loss and violence and the impact that those things can have on someone, how they can consume someone's life. We feel the struggle of the protagonist through the gameplay, her obsession in the face of constant violence and death, her stubborn determination to complete her journey of revenge as symbolized by the central metaphor of the aging mechanic and the determination of the player to get back up after death to see things through to the bitter end. And yet, on the other hand, at times it feels like Sifu just wants to be a cool-looking martial arts video game. Sifu is filled with surface-level allusions to martial arts media that are there just for the sake of being there. In later patches to the game, the developers even added a bonus game mode called Arenas, gameplay challenges that are completely separate from the game's story and which employ very hollow allusions to martial arts movies. For example, you have the Matrix challenge where time slows down every time you block. These arenas take elements from the main game, including the 5 main bosses themselves, and strip them of the narrative and emotional meaning they have in the main story of the game. In addition to these arena challenges, the developers also added a feature to record and edit gameplay so that you can create really cool looking movie-like replays of fight sequences. And lastly, the developers also added a set of modifiers that you can apply to the main game to make the combat more difficult or silly, a scoring system that grades the player's performance, and a bunch of challenges and unlockable outfits for players to collect, all of which gives the impression that maybe telling a story wasn't really the main goal of Sifu at all. Some games are not meant to be played multiple times. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is one of those games. Hellblade is an incredible game, but it is also a game that wears you down emotionally. Hellblade delves into some very dark and heavy themes such as loss, abuse, and mental illness, and it puts its protagonist through hell, literally and figuratively. Accordingly, the developers decided to tone down the complexity of the combat, to simplify it so that the gameplay wouldn't get in the way of the game's narrative. When you beat Hellblade, you don't feel like you want to replay it all over again to get all the collectibles and get better at it. No, when you beat Hellblade, you want to put the game aside and unpack everything that you just went through, to mull it over and think about it throughout the course of weeks or months, you know, like you do after you read a really good novel. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Doom Eternal, a game that has a silly mess of a story that we're not really meant to take seriously. But you know what else Doom Eternal has? One of the greatest gameplay loops ever designed for a game. Playing Doom Eternal is a mesmerizing experience that pushes you beyond limits you didn't even know you had. As such, everything in the game is designed with the single-minded intention of supporting the game's central loop, even at the cost of neglecting its story. Unlike Hellblade, the second you beat Doom Eternal, you wanna dive straight into another playthrough to conquer all of the game's difficulties and collect everything in the game, and simply just to keep playing it. Sifu, however, is a game that can't decide what it wants to commit to. Sifu wants to have a cool take on dying as a mechanic that is hard and demands a lot from the player, but it also wants to be an accessible game that anybody can play. Sifu wants to tell an interesting story about violence and loss, but it also wants to be just a cool-looking martial arts game with tons of replayability and a bunch of hollow allusions to martial arts media. But, of course, in the end, Sifu does commit to something. I think it's clear that ultimately, Sifu's highest priority is its masterfully crafted combat, and it is perhaps because of this focus on gameplay that the story ultimately suffers. Rather than building towards an emotional climax that brings a meaningful resolution to the themes of the story, we get instead a very uninspired take on the whole good ending versus bad ending convention that fails to say anything at all. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to argue here that Sifu ultimately needed to fully commit to one extreme of the gameplay story spectrum or the other, that it needed to be either Hellblade or Doom Eternal in order to be successful. Many games exist all across this spectrum, finding their own way to bring together story and gameplay in a manner that fits the particular vision suited for the experience that they are trying to create. But having said that, Sifu, to me, just feels like a game that can't quite capitalize on the very interesting ideas that it presents, either in terms of its gameplay or narrative elements. And yet, the truth is that, in the end, I would not be making this video if I didn't think that Sifu is, ultimately, a fascinating example of video game storytelling, one that has captivated me since the first moment I played it. The thing about Sifu is that when its gameplay and story elements are working together towards a greater narrative whole, it is able to create some of the most amazing moments I've ever experienced in any game.
In the end, you're still that same child I knew. Helpless. Like the night I killed your father. You're here, in front of me, only because of this pendant. But what if I take it from you? Will you fear death once again?
You sound like the frightened one to me.
As I was working on this project, I decided to do a challenge run of the game because I wanted to capture some cool footage to show in the video. I beat the game while remaining at age 20 on Master difficulty, which means that I had to clear each individual level without dying, what speedrunners and challenge gamers would call a segmented, deathless run. This was a really difficult challenge, but once I completed it, I couldn't stop. I've continued to play Sifu for literally more than 150 hours because it is an addicting game. I've gotten the true ending in Master difficulty, and I've tried to complete runs with relatively high scores in each level. Right now, I'm in the process of collecting all gold stamps for all of the arenas, and I've done some other challenge runs of the main game where I crank up some really unfair modifiers. With the limited amount of time that daily life affords and the pages-long backlog of games that I've been meaning to get to, it's not often that I spend so much time trying to really delve into a game's mechanics until the point that I can say that I've truly mastered it. You know, as much as you can master a game that you play casually. But there is something truly special about Sifu in this regard. I've gotten to a level of skill where the game truly feels like a power fantasy, like I'm the protagonist in a John Wick movie. But crucially, this is not what a first playthrough of Sifu feels like. A first playthrough of Sifu does not look like this.
Forget about it. If you're not on the list, you're in
Private part. Back up!
Yeah?
Who the fuck are you?
Please, don't hit me!
Some martial arts movies, the ones that really capture your imagination and stick with you, are not just visually cool, but rather they use the very concept of martial arts, the visual performance of it, to craft a deep story with something to say. That being said, however, you could argue that, in a more general sense, most martial arts movies are essentially very simple power fantasies. As such, it's rare to see a piece of martial arts media where the protagonist is vulnerable, and I mean truly vulnerable. Now, video games in general are very good at creating these kinds of power fantasies too, often without much thought behind what this experience has to say on a narrative level. It never ceases to surprise me how embedded violence is within the medium of games, how ingrained it is into the very language of video game mechanics. Sometimes, the whole identity of a game centers around how good said game can make violence feel. How well it can conjure that feeling of being in a power fantasy in a way that is completely divorced from any deeper narrative meaning. Which is obviously okay. I'm not trying to make an argument against violence in games, but it's still interesting when a game does manage to make you think about this facet of its identity. Sifu, for me, has gotten to an interesting point after more than 100 hours of playtime. Every time I play it, I feel like a badass. I just go into a flow state and beat the hell out of a bunch of people and call it a day. And don't get me wrong, getting better at the game has made me really appreciate the craft of Sifu's developers, the way they have created a truly masterful gameplay loop. However, getting good at the game has also made me extremely aware of how different my first playthrough of the game felt, which in turn has made me realize that it was during my very first playthrough that the gameplay and story of Sifu were at its closest in how these two sides worked to create a greater narrative depth for the game's overall story. Sifu, like many martial arts movies, features a protagonist who is going up against overwhelming odds. I mean, you're facing against whole armies of enemies in this game. You're blitzing through a whole neighborhood full of people, through a museum, a whole ass corporate tower packed with people trying to take you down. And yet, unlike most martial arts movies, the only reason that you and the protagonist of the game can do this is because you can literally get back up after you've been killed. Both you and the protagonist are literally cheating. In this way, the gameplay and the story of the game inform each other to create a sense of ludonarrative consistency, also called sometimes ludonarrative consonance or harmony, because it brings together the experience of the protagonist and that of the player. Despite the fact that she spent 8 years training, the protagonist of the game is not a badass. I mean, she is, but not in the same magnitude as John Wick, not on a level that allows her to just fight through a building full of people. No, the only reason that the protagonist can ultimately enact her quest for revenge is because she has a talisman that revives her every time she dies. And this fact adds a very interesting and very dark tone to the game's story. During your first playthrough of Sifu, you will die. A lot, and in very awkward and silly and ungraceful, sometimes straight up comical ways. But you keep getting back up, and the more you keep getting back up, the more you get a sense that there is a very twisted kind of determination at play here, a perverted sense of willpower and perseverance ingrained into this cycle of dying just so that you can get back up only to die again over and over. Now, this is the same process that I've gone through on virtually every other game I've ever played, but there's something in Sifu that made me think about this cycle, this loop, something that I've done a million times in a million different variations in a completely different and new way. To beat Sifu, to attain that ultimate goal of revenge, both the protagonist and the player need to give in to this twisted sense of repetition and violence. In Sifu, as in any other game, you just keep getting back up over and over after you die. Sometimes you even get stubborn. You think, I'm gonna beat this level or I'm gonna beat this level. But slowly, over the course of the game, a darker tone begins to fall over the narrative and the mechanics of the game as a whole because, unlike other games, the protagonist is actually literally dying over and over every time that you die, every time that you get back up only to die again. Just like you, the protagonist is stubborn. She has given in to the pain and the violence. She has developed a twisted sense of will that carries her back up to her feet so that she can continue to die and to kill others. She has embraced fully this cycle of violence and death. and in this way, the game subverts the expectations that you, as a player, might have had about how the concept of violence is supposed to work within the medium of games in general. The first time I beat Yang, the final boss of the game, an extremely difficult fight that took me a long time to finally overcome, I got a rush of adrenaline. I thought, hell yeah, finally, come get it, Yang. And yet, just as the protagonist's sigh of relief at the end is undercut by a pained expression, so too did I feel a pang of regret. This joy I felt at finally overcoming the final boss of the game was quickly overshadowed by my realization of the things that came before it, all of the pain and violence and death, the incalculable cost of it all, and the emptiness that is left in its wake. I understand the thinking behind the developers' decision to include a true ending that allows the protagonist to reach some kind of redemption. By forcing us to replay the game after killing Yang, we come to understand that the protagonist is trapped in an endless cycle, one that cannot be broken by violence alone. The only way to break free is by accepting that you must find a different way to move forward. The protagonist must let go of her anger, of her desire for revenge, and it is only then that she can finally break this loop that she is caught in. But Sifu doesn't commit to this narrative. Not really. This emotional turn doesn't work because it's not in sync with the gameplay in the same manner that killing Yang during your first playthrough is. Playing through Sifu multiple times doesn't push you to let go of violence, it pushes you to embrace it because the better you get at the game, the better it feels to play it, the more it becomes a true power fantasy. The story of the game is telling you that the only way to break free is to let go, but the gameplay is telling you to go ahead and play the game again, get better, see if you can get a higher score or do a deathless run just for fun, or add on some modifiers to unlock some new costumes. Ultimately, I kind of wish that the developers of Sifu would have had faith in the fact that the final boss fight against Yang could have been enough to serve as an emotional resolution to the story and that they would have committed to it. And the reason I say this is because the truth is that killing Yang at the end of my first playthrough of Sifu was one of the most emotionally charged moments that I've ever experienced in a game before or since. The final fight against Yang is truly a masterpiece. For one, Yang is really difficult. You might have found a way to brute force your progress through the game up to this point, but that will not be enough for this final encounter. If you want to defeat Yang, you must truly learn to master this fight, which only adds to that twisted sense of resolve required to beat the game. I also really love that during the second phase of the fight, you kick Yang through a set of doors and into a new area, an area that you suddenly realize is the same place, the same moment, the same rainy night when Yang killed the protagonist's father 8 years ago. This is a very subtle but very powerful way to underline the state of mind of the main character. Even though she's fighting Yang in the present, the protagonist is also suddenly caught in the past, trapped in that one moment that defined her whole existence. And this symbolism also outlines the way in which the protagonist is unable or unwilling to even care about Yang's motivations, his pain, his backstory involving the Guardians and the Alchemists. All that the protagonist can see is her path to revenge. Everything else fades away. However, for me, the best moment in the whole game came right at the end, once I finally managed to defeat Yang. Like I just said, Yang is an extremely difficult fight, which means that when I was finally able to beat him, the fight came down to the very last punch. I was already above 70 years old and close to death. I knew that if I died one more time, I'd have to start all over again. But in one final second of clutch, I was barely able to kill Yang before he killed me. At that moment, I let a massive sigh of relief, my hands shaking. But then the final cutscene of the game started playing, and I was suddenly confronted by a close-up shot of the protagonist's face. And that image felt like a punch, a slap to my face because of how viscerally aware it made me feel of how old my character actually was. At that moment I realized so vividly that the protagonist was an old woman now. which meant that my time playing through this game was actually, literally her whole life. All of the hours I spent playing and replaying levels over and over, grinding away at the game, doing nothing but beating the living hell out of other people and dying only to get back up and do it again. This endless fight, this endless repetition of going through the club and the museum and the tower and the club again and the museum and back to the tower. This was it. This was all that the protagonist ever knew, and that's all that she, an old woman now, will ever know. That's all that she will ever be. This game was her whole life, and seeing that now, seeing her face, I was at once truly shaken. It is, like I said at the beginning of the video, a metaphorical cycle of violence that consumes a person's life taken to a literal extreme, as represented by the old woman who now stood in front of me. This brief moment, in a game that is at times too obsessed with the aesthetics of martial arts, made me deeply consider the manner in which I consume violence within the medium of games in a way that I had never experienced before. If there's something to know about me as a gamer, is that I am stubborn as hell. I mean, I am one of those tryhards that always has to pick the hardest difficulty and just does not stop until I've finished. Much in the same way that the protagonist of Sifu is obsessed, I can get obsessed with the prospect of beating a game. And yet, the true tragedy of Sifu is that, for the protagonist, there is no moving on. There is nothing to move on to. Her life is over, metaphorically and literally, as she is now an old woman. And the cycle of violence and death that Sifu is, this is all she ever knew. It was her whole life. It was everything she ever was, and now she doesn't even have that anymore. Now there is only emptiness, and that broke my heart.